9. Crystal Villanueva. 911 dispatchers in Hays County, Texas, received a series of alarming phone calls in January 2017 after a 24-year-old woman named Crystal Villanueva attacked her daughter and her father-in-law with a knife. Her father-in-law, Eustorgio Arellano Uresti, managed to escape the residence in Kyle and dial 911 after being stabbed in the back of the head. By the time a SWAT team forced their way into the home, it was too late to save Crystal's daughter, Giovanna Hernandez. Officers found Crystal naked and freshly showered in a front room. During her trial for Giovanna's murder, Crystal claimed that she stabbed the victims while under the delusion that they had been replaced by clones, and that she had to kill them in order to bring back her real family members. Her defense attorney urged the jury to find her not guilty by reason of insanity, arguing that Crystal Villanueva suffered from a psychiatric condition known as Capgras syndrome, or delusion of doubles. The defendant also had a history of drug and alcohol abuse, and was allegedly under the influence at the time of the murder. Despite Crystal's documented history of mental issues, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 8. Ryan Sweet. In a disturbing case of deadly road rage that took place in Massachusetts in April 2024, 26-year-old Destiny Dekoff was fatally struck by an enraged driver in the Boston suburb of Hopkinton. The impact of the collision was so forceful that it sent the young woman flying into the air and ripped her clothes off. Dekoff arrived at the emergency room clinging to life and covered head to toe with injuries. She had multiple broken bones, internal bleeding, a brain bleed, and collapsed lungs. She succumbed to her injuries in the hospital after fighting for her life for 3 days. Identified by police as 36-year-old Ryan Sweet, the driver of the Honda Civic that struck Dekoff accused the car he hit of brake-checking him and giving him no time to avoid a collision. When an officer pulled the suspect over, he allegedly claimed that the victim and her friends were trying to kill him. According to investigators, however, Sweet rammed his vehicle into the victim during a fit of road rage. A witness told local station WBZ that he saw Sweet driving away before the crash, only to make a U-turn and slam into Dekoff at a high rate of speed. Sweet was charged with multiple crimes, including assault and battery with a dangerous weapon causing serious bodily injury. Following Dekoff's death, his charges were upgraded to murder. After Sweet's arraignment, a fight broke out in the courthouse hallway between his family and Dekoff's loved ones. Thankfully, no one was seriously injured or got arrested. The outcome of the case remains to be seen. 7. Jesse Hernandez. On what began as a normal morning in November 2023, sheriff's deputies in Okaloosa County, Florida, responded to a call from a woman claiming her boyfriend had stolen her car. The suspect, Marquis Johnson, returned to the residence while law enforcement was still there. He was handcuffed and placed into the back seat of a patrol car while the responding deputies continued to assess the situation. At some point during the investigation, then Deputy Jesse Hernandez returned to the patrol car to perform a secondary check on the suspect. He mistook the sound of acorns falling on the vehicle as gunshots and dropped to the ground while yelling, "Shots fired." Hernandez even mistakenly believed that he had been shot and cried out, "I'm hit, I'm hit." He then grabbed his service weapon and opened fire on the vehicle while another deputy at the scene also began shooting. Thankfully, Johnson managed to escape the path of gunfire without injury. The shocking incident prompted an internal investigation, which found that Hernandez most likely did not act with malice, but was unreasonable in his use of force. He resigned from his position while his coworker was cleared of any wrongdoing and remains on the force. 6. Norman Scott. Early one evening in May of 2024, deputies in Palm Beach County, Florida, responded to a reported shooting in the village of Wellington's Black Diamond residential neighborhood. They arrived at the scene to find a married couple, Tara Mary Jones and Taylor Glenn Jones, with multiple gunshot wounds. A witness told police that they found the victims bleeding profusely on the ground after hearing gunshots. As the Good Samaritan attempted to render first aid, the suspected shooter exited the couple's home. Later identified as 63-year-old Norman Scott, he allegedly approached the neighbor and said, "Don't worry, I shot them both," before walking away from the scene. After being apprehended by police, Scott claimed that the victims had attacked him, despite the absence of any weapons near their bodies. According to law enforcement, the deadly shooting stemmed from a disagreement over property boundaries and the placement of a basketball hoop. Surveillance footage from Scott's home appeared to contradict his version of events. In the video, he could be seen waving Taylor Jones over for a chat. Jones approached Scott in a non-threatening manner and remained composed, while Scott got in his face. At some point in the video, Scott pulled a gun and shot Jones multiple times before turning the gun on Tara, who witnessed her husband's murder from a few dozen feet away. Tara tried to retreat, but was gunned down in cold blood. As he left the property, Scott walked past Taylor and shot him 2 more times. He's now facing 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder with a firearm and remains held without bond pending the outcome of his case. 5. John Guzzi. 60-year-old Derek Prindle and his 26-year-old son, Derek Prindle Jr., were driving along a rural road in Chenango County, New York in October 2014, when the driver of a pickup truck began tailgating them. Later identified as 53-year-old retired NYPD officer John Guzzi, the enraged motorist then cut in front of the Prindle's vehicle and slammed on the brakes. Unsure of what the problem was, Prindle waved at Guzzi to pull into a gym parking lot. Both vehicles pulled over, but Guzzi was apparently in no mood to talk things out in a civilized fashion. According to prosecutors, he approached the Prindle's vehicle and spat in the elder Prindle's face through the open window. Guzzi also allegedly threatened to kill the victims. The altercation escalated into physical violence, which ended with the younger Prindle being fatally shot. He died in the arms of his father, who was shot in the torso and survived. Guzzi left the scene and later turned himself in at a state trooper barracks. He was charged with 17 crimes, including second-degree murder, attempted murder, carrying an unlicensed firearm, 2 counts of assault, several weapon-related counts, and driving while intoxicated. The accused murderer opted for a bench trial, which meant that his fate would be decided by the judge rather than a jury. Testifying in his own defense, Guzzi admitted to drinking several cans of hard lemonade over lunch before the road rage incident. He offered a noticeably different version of events than the prosecution, claiming that Prindle was driving irrationally and started problems with him on the road for no reason. Guzzi accused the Prindles of being the first to exit their vehicle and coming at him aggressively. He said he pulled his gun with the intention of using it as a blunt object and admitted firing the weapon, claiming he was acting in self-defense and out of a fear for his life. The judge found Guzzi guilty on multiple counts, including murder and attempted murder, and sentenced him to 40 years to life in prison. He appealed his case, but the original ruling was upheld. 4. Leslie Sanders. 79-year-old Vietnam veteran Larry Lynn Myers was on his way to dialysis in Dundas, Minnesota in June of 2022 when he got into a fender bender with a vehicle driven by 53-year-old Leslie Sanders. According to witnesses, Sanders cut Myers off, causing a minor collision between their vehicles. Sanders allegedly exited his truck, approached Myers' SUV on foot, and punched the senior citizen through the open window of his vehicle. The elderly victim was taken to the hospital with a brain injury and multiple facial fractures. Myers spent 9 days on life support before succumbing to brain damage. Following his death, authorities charged Sanders with multiple crimes in connection with the fatal assault. He eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a 12-year prison sentence. Under the terms of his plea agreement, Sanders is required to serve at least 2/3 of his term behind bars before becoming eligible for parole. He declined to speak during his sentencing hearing, but apologized for his actions through his attorney. 3. Petrit Lekaj. Petrit Lekaj allegedly made a living by trafficking heroin in and around Adelaide, Australia. But he wanted his daughter, 20-year-old Sabrina Lekaj, to do better. Unfortunately, the young woman fell into a lifestyle of partying and drug use. Her father found out about it after she was in a minor car accident in 2019 and was taken to the hospital for a drug test. Feeling both upset and betrayed by Sabrina's life decisions, Petrit fatally stabbed her after picking her up at the hospital later that night. According to prosecutors, Petrit plunged the knife into his daughter's abdomen while they were sitting in her car. He then held his hand over Sabrina's mouth and stabbed her 7 more times. Sabrina died from her injuries, and her father was charged with her murder. Following his arrest, Petrit said that something came over him. He said he couldn't explain his actions and that he wasn't himself at the time of the crime. Prosecutors pointed out the irony of Petrit's actions, which denied Sabrina the opportunity to turn her life around like her father wanted her to do. There was also an air of hypocrisy to the crime, considering Petrit's past conviction for trafficking heroin at 26 years old. The defense acknowledged that Sabrina was more or less acting like a typical teenager and that she needed guidance and care, 2 things that her father was apparently incapable of providing. In 2020, Petrit was found guilty of Sabrina's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. A police officer who spent time with Sabrina after the accident was so traumatized by the news of the murder that she spent more than 2 years out of work. She has since returned to part-time duty, but health professionals have concluded that she will most likely never work full-time again due to her ongoing mental health issues. The woman had a history of not showing much emotion, leaving her colleagues shocked by how deeply the murder affected her. She reportedly blamed herself for Sabrina's death, even though the responsibility for the tragedy falls squarely on Petrit. 2. Maxwell Logan. 38-year-old Philip Holland was sorting through his mail in the kitchen of his San Diego home in August of 2023 when a stranger suddenly entered the residence, later identified as 25-year-old Maxwell Logan. The intruder stabbed Holland to death in a frenzied knife attack, plunging the blade into the victim's body upwards of 40 times. By the time Holland's roommate arrived home and found him dead on the floor, Logan had fled the scene. Later that night, the accused killer allegedly held his girlfriend captive inside their apartment, which is located in the same complex as Holland's unit. Logan was also accused of threatening to harm his girlfriend and the couple's pets. Police were alerted to the situation after Logan's girlfriend saw officers investigating Holland's death and dropped notes out of the window pleading for help. Thankfully, she was uninjured, and Holland was charged with multiple counts in connection to both crimes, including murder, assault, and false imprisonment. The suspect also faces a misdemeanor battery charge for kicking a woman who was walking her dog near the apartment complex. During questioning, Logan allegedly admitted to the homicide and implied that he was triggered by voices in his head. He also reportedly said that he believed he was living in a digital simulation and that he had to kill Holland in order to return to the real world. The 2 men did not know each other prior to the deadly attack, despite living in the same building. Logan pleaded not guilty due to insanity and remains held without bond as he awaits trial. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. 1. Dravin Robinson. Trenton Butterfield and his girlfriend were driving in Kearns, Utah one afternoon in October 2023 when they noticed a nearby motorist weaving in and out of traffic. The couple were behind the erratic driver, later identified as 23-year-old Dravin Robinson, when he allegedly slammed on the brakes. According to a police report, Butterfield and Robinson got into a shouting match. Butterfield later told ABC4 that no words were exchanged before Robinson pointed a gun at him and pulled the trigger. The bullet hit Butterfield's hat and knocked it onto the floor, narrowly missing both him and his girlfriend. As the car filled with smoke, Butterfield panicked. He initially thought he'd been struck by the bullet and pulled over to check himself for wounds and to dial 911. Thankfully, he wasn't shot, but the bullet's impact on his hat caused him to suffer migraines and a possible concussion. The frayed and burned hat was turned over to the police as evidence. During questioning, Robinson allegedly apologized for his actions, stating that he was sorry it had to get to that point. He asked several times if the victims were okay and said that he didn't know what came over him. Butterfield acknowledged that Robinson might regret how he handled the incident, but it unfortunately didn't alleviate the emotional trauma that he and his girlfriend suffered in the aftermath of the terrifying encounter. Robinson was charged with 3 counts of felony aggravated assault, 1 count of felony discharge of a firearm, misdemeanor criminal mischief, and a disorderly conduct infraction.
Number 12. Cheryl Romont. In November 2016, 35-year-old Cheryl Romont showed up at her neighbor's house in Las Vegas covered in blood. She informed them that she had just shot her boyfriend, Matthew Bernardi, and the neighbor dialed 911. While responding to Romont's residence, police also discovered Bernardi slumped over in his car in the nearby desert. He was clinging to life with a gunshot wound to the chest. He died from his injuries later that night. During questioning, Romont told investigators that she and Bernardi had met and began dating 7 months earlier. She claimed that the relationship became toxic shortly after Bernardi moved in with her, and that he was physically and verbally abusive. Romont had never called the police on her boyfriend, but many domestic violence victims are silent about their struggles, so this didn't necessarily mean that it wasn't happening. The day of the shooting began without any problems for the couple, according to Romont. But they began to argue while gambling at a casino, and the disagreement only escalated while they drove home. When they arrived, Romont remained in the car while Bernardi went inside to pack his belongings. While she waited, she was overcome with the feeling that something bad was about to happen. She grabbed her gun from beneath the car seat, just in case she needed to use it. Romont claimed that Bernardi ran outside, threatened to kill her, and bashed her head into the vehicle's dashboard. And at some point they got into a struggle, and Romont felt obligated to defend herself with deadly force. She fully admitted to shooting Bernardi and stood by her claim that she acted in self-defense. The police saw it differently, and they charged her with murder. Romont's friends and neighbors were quick to back up her claims of abuse. Those who lived near her confirmed that they frequently overheard screaming and fighting, and some people went as far as saying that Romont was beaten daily. A neighbor said that even after shooting Bernardi, Romont rushed over in an effort to contact authorities as soon as possible, in hopes that emergency responders would be able to save his life. The court eventually concluded that Romont was telling the truth about the circumstances surrounding the shooting. Her murder charge was reduced to manslaughter, and it was eventually dropped. Romont was sentenced to 2 years of probation for a lesser charge and was ordered to undergo mental health and substance abuse evaluations. Number 11. Boyfriend's brutal ambush. A 38-year-old Hungarian woman who lived in Alicante, Spain, was walking home one evening in 2016 when her partner, a Ukrainian immigrant, attacked her out of nowhere. CCTV footage of the ambush showed the boyfriend lying in wait as the unsuspecting woman approached her residence. In the video, the man could be seen choking his girlfriend as she entered their apartment building's foyer. He threw the woman to the ground and repeatedly punched her in the head as she begged him to stop. The boyfriend paid no attention to his partner's anguished pleas as he grabbed her hair and dragged her face down up a staircase and into an elevator. It's unclear what happened after that, but it's probably safe to assume that the brutality continued behind closed doors. After beating the victim for 5 minutes, the man went outside to make sure nobody could see what was going on. He then re-entered the building and continued battering his girlfriend. While checking the footage for evidence of an ongoing theft problem in the building, security workers were horrified by what they saw. They turned the video of the attack over to police, who had not received a report from the woman and were unaware of the incident up until that point. As it turned out, she was afraid to press charges out of fear that her partner would only become more violent. After seeing the video, authorities charged the alleged attacker. Hopefully, the woman found safety and ended the abusive relationship. Number 10. Michael and Ellen Snyder. Michael Snyder was a simple man. He worked as a master mechanic in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and enjoyed outdoor activities and spending time with his family and friends. In 1994, he met Ellen DeBaca, a successful single mom who worked as a manager at his workplace. The pair eventually married, built their dream house, and had a daughter together. By all outward appearances, the future looked bright for Michael and Ellen, but the couple hit a bump in the road in 2011 when Michael was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. No longer able to work, he was forced to go on disability. It was a difficult adjustment after spending his entire adult life in the workforce, and he struggled with his mental health. These changes put strain on his marriage to Ellen, but the couple maintained a happy image to the outside world. In early 2002, Ellen called Michael's family and said that he had left her. They were shocked since they didn't realize the two were having problems, and they were even more concerned when they tried to contact Michael and couldn't reach him. Ellen insisted that her husband was alive and well, and that he was simply choosing to abandon his life. His loved ones had a hard time believing it, especially because they didn't think Michael would ever willingly cut ties with his daughter. But their attempts to find him went nowhere, even after they got the authorities involved. Over the 8 years following Michael's disappearance, Ellen told people that he was mentally and sometimes physically abusive. She also told his family that he had left her for a man, which only made her story seem even more like tall tales, since they knew that Michael was strictly into women. Any efforts to find Michael hit a dead end until 2010, when a friend of Ellen's adult son contacted police and accused Ellen of burying his body in her yard. Investigators questioned Ellen's son, who was initially hesitant to come forward. He eventually admitted that his friend's story was true and that they had helped Ellen bury Michael after she shot him 8 years earlier. According to the two witnesses, Michael was buried deep in the ground. They claimed that Ellen had rented equipment to dig the grave with. After filling it back in, she covered the site with a concrete slab. Police obtained a search warrant and began digging. Sure enough, they uncovered Michael's body, finally solving the mystery of his whereabouts nearly a decade after he was last seen alive. Just as she had told Michael's family members, Ellen told police that her husband abused her. She claimed that they got into a major argument on his last night alive, and that he flew into a rage when she threatened to out him for supposedly being gay. Fearing for her life, Ellen shot her husband. Then she buried him because she was afraid that law enforcement would accuse her of foul play. Many people doubt Ellen's story to this day, but there wasn't enough evidence to disprove that Michael died as the result of a domestic argument that got out of hand. She pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and several other charges, and served an 11-year prison sentence. To Michael's loved ones, it was a far cry from justice, but to prosecutors, it was better than nothing. Number 9. Alex Kogut and Clayton Whitmore. When 18-year-old Alexandra Kogut left her hometown in upstate New York for a college 2.5 hours away in 2012, she was determined to make her relationship with her boyfriend work long distance. Things seemed to be going well between her and 21-year-old Clayton Whitmore when he traveled to Alex's college to see her after her first month there. The visit initially went well. On the first day of Clayton's visit, the couple went out to dinner, hung out with friends, and then returned to Alex's dorm shortly after midnight. Just a few hours later, Alex's mother was overcome by a bad feeling. She listened to her gut and asked the campus police to go check on her daughter. The officer who responded to the call walked in on a complete bloodbath. It resembled a scene from a horror movie. Alex was laying face down on the floor and was unresponsive. Someone had beaten her to death, and Clayton was nowhere to be found. Campus police remembered Clayton from earlier that night. They had issued him an open container ticket and had noticed that he and Alex didn't seem to be getting along too well. A review of Alex's social media revealed a tweet from around that time stating that she should have known. Shortly after the young woman's body was found, both of Clayton's parents called law enforcement and reported that their son had confessed to doing something. Clayton then called the police himself and told them the same thing. During questioning, he explained that he and Alex had gotten into a rare argument that night because he felt like she was acting more bubbly toward other people than she was toward him. He felt disrespected, and the disagreement continued after they got back to Alex's dorm room. The fight escalated into cheating allegations, and at some point, Clayton lost control of his temper and beat his girlfriend to death using multiple objects, including his fists and a clothing iron. He also stabbed Alex with pens and pencils with such force that the tips broke off. While speaking with investigators, he described Alex's suffering as like watching an animal suffer. He claimed that he killed Alex to put her out of her misery. During his trial, Clayton's lawyer argued that his client acted during an episode of severe emotional disturbance stemming from trauma caused by childhood abuse. The prosecution painted the defendant out as a cold-blooded killer who acted with awareness and intent, and an ex-girlfriend of Clayton's testified to his abusive tendencies, begging the question of whether his relationship with Alex had seemed more picture-perfect than it actually was. Clayton Whitmore was convicted of the young woman's murder and received a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. Alex's family hopes that he never sees daylight outside prison walls again. Number 8. Chad Marek and Regan Gibbs. 25-year-old Regan Gibbs's life was cut short in 2022 when she was murdered in her apartment in Lawrence, Kansas. She was cruelly robbed of her dreams to someday have a career helping the homeless and the mentally ill, and all the other things she wanted to do in life. Regan's husband, 27-year-old Chad Marek, allegedly told police that God told him to kill his wife. He was charged with first-degree murder. Marek has a history of domestic violence convictions, which he was repeatedly sentenced to probation for. For Regan's grieving family, her untimely demise highlights the dangers of domestic violence. Shortly after she was killed, they traveled to Lawrence to raise awareness about the warning signs of abuse in relationships. Regan's loved ones told the Lawrence Times that they noticed disturbing changes when she moved back to Kansas after living in Arizona for a short period. They said that Marek pulled Regan away from her family through religious and spiritual manipulation. Marek also allegedly isolated his wife from her family and friends. Regan's mother, Kristen Gibbs, said that she only met Marek once, and even during that one meeting, his influence on Regan was evident. Eventually, the family only heard from Regan through occasional phone calls that she was required to make on speakerphone in front of her husband. Her loved ones were left feeling helpless as they tried to help free her from Marek's constant oversight. In the wake of her daughter's death, Regan's mother urged the public to be relentless in their attempts to help when they suspect that someone is being abused by their partner. She also stressed the importance of learning about and studying the signs that may indicate someone is in a dangerous relationship. In June of 2022, Marek was found incompetent to stand trial. As of October, he was on a long waiting list for evaluation at a local mental hospital. The case appears to remain at a standstill while the court waits for staff at the hospital to address Marek's mental health. Number 7. Julie and Jason Harper. By the time Julie Harper decided to leave her husband Jason in 2012, their marriage was far beyond saving. The misery they lived in stood in stark contrast to their seemingly idyllic beginnings just a decade or so earlier, when they moved into their seaside home in Carlsbad, California, as newlyweds. 3 kids and countless arguments later, Julie decided that she had no more fight left in her. After consulting with a lawyer and filing for divorce, she began gathering the kids' passports and other documents. It's unclear whether she planned to leave the country or perhaps go somewhere else, but she was preparing for the next chapter either way. But a divorce wouldn't be necessary because tragedy struck just days after Julie filed. When the 39-year-old failed to show up at his school teaching job, his colleagues went to his house and found him dead from a gunshot wound to the chest. Julie and the kids were nowhere to be found. Less than a day later, Julie surrendered to police in the company of her lawyer. She was charged with first-degree murder, but insisted all along that she shot Jason in self-defense. Julie refused to speak to authorities, but she claimed during her trial that her husband was highly abusive and that it went on for years. She even had voice recordings and some other evidence to suggest that her claims were valid. The fight that led to the deadly shooting allegedly started when Jason began screaming at Julie because he thought she had hidden his laptop. Julie testified that the argument quickly became physical as she fought desperately to get away from her irate husband. She said that Jason was charging at her and threatening to kill her when she made the fateful decision to retrieve the gun she had been keeping under her pillow for a year, just in case. According to her testimony, she didn't mean to shoot Jason. The gun accidentally discharged, and a bullet just happened to pierce his chest. Meanwhile, the prosecution depicted Julie as a heartless killer who shot Jason in cold blood, denying any claims that he even hit her or that the shooting was an accident. Julie was acquitted of first-degree murder at her first trial, but the jury became hopelessly deadlocked while trying to decide if she was guilty of second-degree murder. A second jury convicted Julie of second-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. She continues to maintain her innocence from behind bars, but it doesn't appear likely that she'll convince a court that she was wrongly convicted. Number 6. Courtney Clenny and Christian Obumseli. Known to her OnlyFans followers as Courtney Taylor, 25-year-old Courtney Clenny was a successful model, raking in huge amounts of dough from her 2 million subscribers. She lived in a luxury high-rise in Miami with her boyfriend Christian Obumseli, and from the outside looking in, life seemed better than ever for the couple. But things aren't always as they seem. Police, neighbors, and close friends of Clenny and Obumseli knew that their relationship was unstable. Law enforcement had made numerous visits to the couple's home in response to domestic disputes, and it was allegedly nothing new for neighbors to overhear the pair fighting. According to some people who knew the couple, Courtney was short-tempered and had violent tendencies. But the aggression appeared to be a two-way street. At least one neighbor seemed to think that Obumseli was the more volatile party in the relationship, and one person from the couple's apartment building even claimed to see Obumseli punching Clenny one day in early 2022. About a week after the punching incident, police were called to the residence once again. Officers arrived to find Obumseli suffering from a stab wound to the shoulder. He died from his injuries. Ever since her boyfriend's death, Clenny had steadfastly maintained that she stabbed Obumseli in self-defense. But authorities didn't believe it, and she stands accused of murder. According to the most recent updates on the case, the prosecution isn't ready to go to trial. Clenny has expressed her wishes to get the case over with, but it probably won't go to trial until sometime during 2024. For now, she remains behind bars with an uncertain future. Number 5. Asma Begum and Jalal Uddin. 31-year-old mother of 3, Asma Begum's life came to an unexpected end in early 2019 when her husband, 47-year-old Jalal Uddin, stabbed her to death in their East London home. When police arrived after receiving a call from concerned relatives, they found Asma's lifeless body in the kitchen with multiple stab wounds to her head and neck. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Uddin turned himself into the local police station hours later and was charged with murder. At his trial, prosecutors revealed that Asma had previously told police that he was violent toward her. The court sentenced Uddin to life in prison with a minimum of 19 years. Following the sentencing, Detective Inspector Brett Hagen described Asma as a dedicated mother who was relying on government benefits to raise her children and doing her best given her circumstances. He described Uddin as a gambling addict who squandered what little money the family had on his vices. The day before he murdered Asma, Uddin withdrew £200 from her bank account and gambled it away within an hour. Asma confronted Uddin about the missing money, which was meant for food and other necessities, and paid for it with her life and at the hands of her husband, who embarked on a frenzied stabbing spree and plunged a knife into her flesh more than 50 times. Number 4. Cara and J.J. Ryan. Cara Ryan was working at a high school in Pinellas County, Florida during the 1990s when she crossed paths with John J.J. Ryan, a St. Petersburg police officer she had known since her childhood. They hit it off, and in 1996 they got married. At first, life seemed perfect for the newlyweds. JJ and his daughter from a previous relationship moved into Cara's home by the beach, where the newly formed family spent their evenings relaxing and spending time by the sea. But like many relationships, the marriage eventually hit a snag. Things fell into a rut, and Kara had an affair with someone at her workplace. In 2006, after a decade of marriage, she and JJ divorced. Less than a year after officially going their separate ways, the former couple ran into each other. It would be the first of several times that the spark between them reignited. They became a couple again, but didn't remarry this time around. In 2015, the pair split again, and while they both began dating new people, they continued to see each other on and off. One evening, Kara sent her new boyfriend a steamy photo of herself, but he was at work and couldn't respond, and she was in the mood for attention. So she forwarded the photo to JJ, along with an invitation to come over. What happened next isn't exactly clear. But John ended up at Kara's house that night, and she ended up fatally shooting him with a .38 caliber pistol. To investigators, it looked like Kara lured JJ over with promises of intimacy, but with the intention to murder him. Kara claimed that John got aggressive with her during their visit, and that she shot him in self-defense during a heated argument that got out of control. She was charged with second-degree murder, but prosecutors failed to convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that there was no way Kara acted in self-defense. Even after her acquittal, many people believe that Kara was the abusive party and that she killed JJ in a furious rage because she was upset with him for moving on romantically. Acquaintances of the couple have claimed that Kara wore the pants in the relationship and that she controlled the finances to the point where John wasn't even allowed to have his own bank account or handle his own money. But until or unless enough evidence comes to light to warrant a new trial, Kara remains an innocent woman in the eyes of the law. Sometimes a couple seems to always find their way back to each other out of true love, but more often than not it's because they're codependent, and sometimes it's because people are afraid of change and they tend to gravitate toward the familiar. Number 3. Michael and Bonnie Haim. After concluding that not even a miracle would save her troubled marriage, Bonnie Haim began putting together a secret plan to leave her abusive husband, Michael, and to take their young son, Aaron, with her. She saved money, paid a deposit on an apartment, and even enrolled Aaron in a new school. But Bonnie never got a chance to put her plan into action. She vanished in early 1993 without warning or explanation, and her friends and family immediately suspected foul play. Bonnie's last known contact with anyone outside her household was in a tearful phone call to a friend. Something had obviously gone wrong between her and Michael, but she told a friend she'd talk to them about it the next day and ended the conversation. By that point in the couple's marriage, vicious fights were a regular occurrence. But it wasn't normal for Bonnie to drop off the radar, and her loved ones quickly became concerned for her well-being when nobody saw or heard from her after that night. They became even more alarmed when Bonnie's purse was found in a motel dumpster about 5 miles from her home. Her credit cards and money were in it, ruling out robbery as a motive for whatever happened to her. Investigators naturally began to suspect Michael of harming his wife, but he adamantly insisted that he had no idea where Bonnie was or if she was okay. When detectives got nowhere in their attempts to question him, they returned to the area where Bonnie's purse had been found in search of more clues. They found her car abandoned outside the Jacksonville airport. There was still no sign of Bonnie, but the car provided a telling clue. The driver's seat was pushed way too far back for Bonnie to reach the gas pedals. The last person to drive it was much taller than her. Investigators found Michael's shoe print in the car, but it's not unreasonable to expect that since they were married, so it was hard to tell whether it meant anything significant. With all leads exhausted, law enforcement decided that it was time to question Bonnie and Michael's son, something they had avoided doing up until that point. During an interview with a child psychologist, Aaron claimed that he had seen his father hurting his mom on the night Bonnie was last seen alive. It sounded like Michael had lost his temper and killed Bonnie during a domestic argument. But Aaron was young, and it's easy to challenge a child's credibility in court. Without evidence to back up his claims, the case continued to go nowhere. Answers finally came in 2014, when Aaron was 24 years old. He had taken ownership of his father's house and decided to remodel the backyard. While digging up an old swimming pool, he discovered a concrete slab. He cracked it open and continued to dig until he came across a plastic bag. When he pulled it out of the ground, Aaron realized that it contained human bones. He knew right then and there that his mother had finally been found. 5 years later, and 26 years after Bonnie's disappearance, Michael Haim finally went on trial for murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Number 2. Sarah Jean Hartsfield. Anyone who's been married 5 times has most likely experienced their fair share of turmoil at home. Sarah Jean Hartsfield is no exception, and while some of her former husbands and partners have nothing nice to say about her, others didn't survive to tell their side of the story. Hartsfield married her first husband, high school sweetheart Titus Nornschild, during the early 90s. Nornschild later told reporters that he quickly discovered that there were 2 sides to Sarah: the charming and likable woman he initially fell for, and the highly controlling person she became in the months after they exchanged vows. Their newlywed bliss quickly gave way to constant fighting, and Sarah's cheating proved to be the final straw. The pair divorced in 1995, and Nornschild would later say that he considered himself lucky to be alive. In what may have been the most uneventful relationship of her adult life, Sarah went on to marry her first husband's best friend, Michael Traxler. Their marriage was extremely short-lived, and Traxler has said very little about their time together. In 1999, Sarah entered her 3rd and longest marriage to Ryan Donahue. They met while they were both serving in the military and went on to raise 4 children in Fort Hood, Texas. During the couple's 17 years together, Sarah engaged in at least 2 extramarital affairs across state lines, including one that lasted for 2 years. Ryan Donahue never publicly commented on his marriage to Sarah, but their other children have become some of her most outspoken critics in recent years. By the time Sarah and Ryan called it quits on their marriage in 2016, she was already involved in a long-distance relationship with a military veteran named David Bragg. They eventually got engaged and moved in together in Douglas County, Minnesota. Like most of Sarah's relationships, the pair argued frequently. In 2018, Sarah fatally shot Bragg during a heated disagreement at their home. She claimed that she acted in self-defense, and no criminal charges were brought against her. In keeping with her typical ways, Sarah wasted no time moving on, and 6 months after Bragg's death, along came husband number 4, David George. He would later admit that Sarah pressured him to try killing the wife of ex-husband number 3, Ryan Donahue. Thankfully, it never happened. Sarah met and married her 5th husband, Joseph Hartsfield, in early 2022. Less than a year later, Joseph died of a suspected insulin overdose. Authorities charged Sarah with murder, and she remains behind bars while awaiting trial in the case. Now that her past has drawn national attention, law enforcement is revisiting the shooting of David Bragg in Minnesota. No criminal charges have been pressed in the case, but investigators are now doubtful that Bragg's death was accidental. Sarah has denied pretty much every criminal suspicion or allegation that has ever been put against her, and the present is no different. But not many people seem to be convinced. Even her 2 oldest children and several other family members believe that she's perfectly capable of murder, and that she may have committed more crimes than anyone knows about. We have another great video lined up right after number 1. If you need more of a daily world list dosage, then be sure to stay tuned if you haven't seen that one yet. Number 1. Stephanie Keller and Andy Kimbrell. In May of 2019, officers from the Gardendale Police Department in Alabama arrived at a local residence to find Andy Kimbrell, who worked as a patrolman and a school resource officer in nearby Vestavia Hills, suffering from a gunshot wound. Kimbrell was off duty when the shooting occurred in the home he shared with his wife, 43-year-old Stephanie Keller, and 2 teenagers who were in their bedrooms when their dad was shot. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late to save his life. Keller admitted to shooting her husband during an argument, but claimed it was an accident. She was charged with murder, but was convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter, which is permitted under Alabama law when someone commits an intentional killing due to a sudden heat of passion. At Keller's sentencing, Judge Alaric May listened to members of both her and Kimbrell's families, and while Keller's loved ones repeatedly described the shooting as an accident, Judge May said that he refused to call it that. He recognized that Keller had no priors and was a respected community member before the shooting, but pointed out that the same criteria applied to her victim. He sentenced Keller to 20 years, the maximum of the 10 to 20-year sentence she was facing. Number 18. Christina Harrison. A 26-year-old mother of one named Alexandria Gress Boris was loading groceries into her car on Valentine's Day in 2023 outside a busy Kroger store in Irmo, South Carolina, when she suddenly got into a heated argument with another woman. It all started over a simple disagreement about who had the right of way in the parking lot, according to the police chief overseeing the case, Bobby Dale. Sadly, the fight between Alexandria and 23-year-old Christina Harrison went from 0 to 100 and ended in a gun being pulled out. In an email to Fox News, Dale wrote that Alexandria allegedly spat at the other woman. When she turned away, she was shot in the back of the head. Alexandria died from her wounds. Christina quickly fled the scene in her car, but turned herself in just an hour and a half later. She currently faces charges of murder, unlawfully carrying a pistol, and possession of a weapon during a violent crime. Witnesses, including Alexandria's husband Tyler, confirmed that the two women didn't know each other before the incident. To make the situation even more upsetting, Alexandria's death came only 6 days after her brother was killed in a tragic shooting. Number 17. Tavia Chapman. In August 2022, something sent 24-year-old Tavia Chapman into a blind rage while she waited for her boyfriend outside a Kroger in Cincinnati, Ohio. When Jawan Khalid Lunsford came out of the store, Chapman allegedly rammed into him with her van. She also struck an innocent pedestrian, 58-year-old Christopher Griffith. Surveillance footage from that horrifying day showed a woman who looked like Chapman getting out of the vehicle and punching Lunsford multiple times. The couple's child was actually still in the van during the crash. Griffith died from his injuries, and Lunsford was taken to the hospital with only a broken leg. According to police, Chapman went through Lunsford's phone while he was inside the store and found text messages between her boyfriend and her sister that she didn't approve of. She was indicted on charges of aggravated murder, felony assault, attempted murder, as well as child endangerment. If convicted, she could face life in prison. Number 16. Harry Patterson Jr. During the early morning one day in 2023, 41-year-old Jonathan Gant went into a deli in Queens, New York, and asked the employee behind the counter if they had a cigarette. The worker said no, and Gant allegedly became so angry that he threatened the employee. A 68-year-old man intervened to try and defuse the situation, so Gant left the store only to come back later to get into an argument with the customer, who tried to stop him. A physical fight ensued, during which the elderly man pulled a knife and stabbed Gant straight in the leg. The blade cut into an artery, causing Gant to fatally bleed out. 38-year-old Muhammad Ali, who wasn't involved in the tense situation but had worked at the deli for over a decade, told the New York Daily News that both men were regular customers that he saw often. There had never been any problems with them in the past. Ali was shocked by Gant's anger after being denied a cigarette, since it was out of character, and he struggled to wrap his mind around how the fight escalated into violence so quickly. The alleged stabber fled the scene on foot and locked himself in his apartment after the attack. He later surrendered without incident at the request of police. Authorities have not yet announced whether or not he'll face charges. Gant's friends and family were shocked by the claim that the victim lost his temper. They described Gant as a laid-back and kind person who had no aggressive tendencies. The investigation is still ongoing and will hopefully provide more of the answers his loved ones are looking for. Number 15. Arturo Cuevas and Daisy Barrera. 28-year-old Sunnyside, Queens resident Wilson Chabla Liagikota got caught up in an ongoing fight with his neighbors over a parking spot, which isn't that unusual in New York City. But the spat took a horrifying turn when Liagikota confronted 30-year-old Arturo Cuevas and 27-year-old Daisy Barrera one afternoon during March 2023. In a merciless act of violence that was all captured on camera, Cuevas and Barrera attacked Liagikota. Security footage of the encounter showed a woman repeatedly beating the victim with a bat, while a man stomped, kicked, and struck Liagikota with a weapon in his hand. A witness told police that she saw Cuevas stab the victim multiple times that day. The victim's girlfriend, Delia Chimbe, was also hit as the attack waged on. In the video, the suspects could be seen walking away while Jimbe held Liguacota's hand and called 911. According to the most recent update, the victim is still in the hospital with severe brain trauma while he continues to fight for his life. He recently underwent emergency brain surgery and is on a ventilator. Cuevas and Barrera were taken into custody at their apartment after a brief standoff with law enforcement officers. They were each charged with 1 count of attempted murder and 2 counts of assault and are now being held at Rikers without bond while they await the upcoming steps in their cases. A neighbor who asked to stay anonymous told the New York Daily News that Liguacota is a hard-working man who typically minds his own business and doesn't even know how to fight. She said that he had actually been physically attacked over a parking-related disagreement in the past, and someone had broken his nose during a previous fight. Number 14. Shannon Brandt. In 2022, during a fight over politics with a young man less than half his age, 41-year-old Shannon Brandt rammed into the victim with his truck. The disagreement broke out during the morning in the middle of the street in McHenry, North Dakota. After striking 18-year-old Kayla Ellingson, Brandt called 911 and confessed to what he'd done. He seemed very panicked during the phone call and expressed concerns that Ellingson may do something to him involving an extremist Republican group. Brandt said he overheard the young man making several phone calls and saying something similar to, "You're going to have to come here and handle him." Afraid that he was about to be attacked or worse, Brandt apparently handled the situation by getting into his car and stepping on the gas pedal. During the phone call, Brandt offered to give first aid to Ellingson, but he was told not to by the dispatcher. By the time officers got to the scene, Brandt had already returned to his home in Glenfield, North Dakota. Ellingson later died from his injuries, so Brandt was taken into custody on suspicion of being responsible for the man's death. According to police, he was heavily drunk when they showed up at his house and put him in cuffs. Shortly after the incident, authorities revealed that the only calls Ellingson seemed to make during the time frame he was killed were to his parents. Also, doctors concluded that Ellingson was on the ground at the time he was killed and that his injuries were not consistent with simply being hit by a car, but with being run over entirely. Ellingson's mom told police that her son called her twice right before his death. The first time, he told her that Brandt was asking who his parents were. A few minutes later, he called her again and asked if he should call for help from some friends. At that point, his mother decided to pick him up. On her way to get him, Ellingson called her a third time and mentioned something about someone coming after him. Then, the call suddenly dropped. Brandt was initially charged with murder, but in early 2023, the prosecutor reduced his charge down to manslaughter. No explanation has been offered as to why. Number 13. Family Dollar Fatality. A 43-year-old security guard named Calvin Munnerlyn was simply doing his job by enforcing the COVID mask requirement at the Dollar General store he worked at in Flint, Michigan. He paid a terrible price for it in 2020 when he told a customer, 47-year-old Charmel Teague, that her daughter needed to wear a mask. Teague immediately launched into a rant and spat at Munnerlyn, so he told her to leave the store and asked the cashier not to serve her. Her behavior continued to escalate further, so Munnerlyn had to chase her out of the store and tackle her to the ground. A witness who was shopping at the time said that they remembered hearing either Charmel or her daughter yelling, "Wait until I get back." 20 minutes later, Charmel's husband, 47-year-old Larry Teague, and her son, 23-year-old Ramonier Bishop, went into the Dollar General store for revenge. Larry entered the store and demanded to talk to whoever put their hands on his wife. At the same time, Bishop approached Munnerlyn from behind and shot him in the head. A couple who were shopping at the store during the attack described rushing out of the store and coming face-to-face with Larry, who allegedly warned them to run away. Larry and Bishop fled the scene and went on the run. Authorities apprehended Larry at a hotel in Texas a week later and tracked Bishop to a house in a neighboring town. The suspects were all charged with murder. Charmel's daughter was arrested on suspicion of tampering with evidence, lying to police during the investigation, and accessory after the fact. She pleaded no contest to the charges and was sentenced to time served plus a year of probation. The other 3 defendants went straight to trial. Charmel Teague's lawyer argued that her involvement in the crime was very small. Ramonier Bishop's attorney claimed that her client shot Manolin to defend his stepfather's life after seeing Manolin and another man intimidating him. She adamantly denied that the murder had anything to do with mask requirements or even a fight that happened just 20 minutes earlier between Charmel and Manolin. Needless to say, the jury wasn't convinced, and Bishop and his parents were found guilty of first-degree murder. In the end, they were sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Number 12. Johnny William Walters. During a 3-day alcohol and meth binge in 2020, 47-year-old William Walters took a sip of his friend John Jock McClellan's bottle of whiskey. This small action triggered a drunken argument between the men, who'd been close friends for 30 years, that quickly became physical. It ended with 63-year-old McClellan dead. Walters was very upset over his buddy's death, but he was charged with killing McClellan, whose body showed signs of being struck 30 to 40 times. Prosecutors accused Walters of brutally beating his friend to death, while knowing that McClellan was older, smaller, and weaker than him. In his defense, Walters said that he and McClellan had substance abuse issues and that it fueled their fight. His lawyer, Mark Norman, argued that McClellan's health issues contributed to his death and that he probably would have survived if he were in better condition. Walters was found guilty of a reduced manslaughter charge and was ordered to serve 9 years in prison. The judge acknowledged that he didn't mean to kill McClellan, but said that he should have realized how serious his actions were, especially since the victim was in poor health and used a walking cane. She also pointed toward Walters' lengthy history of violence with 8 prior assault convictions, which suggest a pattern of lacking control over his emotions. Number 11. Mark Storms. In 2017, during a Sunday morning church service in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, 27-year-old Robert Braxton III unknowingly took a seat that was reserved for someone else. A church usher and a clergy member asked him to move at first, but Braxton quickly became agitated, so they just decided to let him stay in the seat. Others remember that Braxton was acting out of character that day. He seemed on edge, but it's unclear what exactly made him act that way. 46-year-old congregation member Mark Storms had no reason to intervene, but he decided to do so anyway. He approached Braxton, showed him his concealed weapon permit while visibly reaching for his gun, and told him to leave. Braxton then punched Storms, who responded by shooting him in the chest in front of 300 churchgoers. Storms was arrested for the shooting and argued that he acted in self-defense, which was hard to believe considering the fact that Braxton was unarmed. A jury convicted Storms of voluntary manslaughter and reckless endangerment, so he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. At his sentencing, the judge alluded to the defendant having a hero complex and a perceived need to inject himself into a dangerous situation. And in the situation with Braxton, the judge said Storms had absolutely no business getting involved at all. Storms appealed his conviction and sentence later on, but another judge upheld the rulings. Number 10. Ricky Braden. At a time when 22-year-old U.S. Army soldier Ricky Braden and his wife Kenesha Johnson should have been in the honeymoon phase of their marriage, they were instead plagued by constant arguments. They got into a particularly vicious fight one day in May 2016 when Braden got angry at Johnson for a photo she posted on social media. There was nothing inappropriate about the picture, but Braden thought his wife was trying to get attention from other men by posting it. He later apologized, so Kenesha thought everything between them was fine, until he showed up at her job in a rage. He was supposed to be on base at Fort Hood that morning, so Johnson was surprised to see him pull into the parking lot at the Walgreens she worked at. She went outside and they argued in the middle of the parking lot, where Kenesha tried convincing her husband that she wasn't doing anything behind his back and that his attention was enough for her. But Braden wasn't listening to reason, and Kenesha eventually gave up trying to have a rational conversation. As she turned to go back into the building, Braden shot at her twice, missing her once and hitting her in the leg. She then ran inside and locked the doors. 35-year-old former Marine T.J. Antel witnessed the incident and tried to perform a citizen's arrest on Braden, who refused to follow his orders and shot him in the head. Antel was pronounced dead at the scene, and Braden turned himself into law enforcement not long after. Just 6 weeks into Braden and Johnson's marriage, a man was dead, another man's life was ruined, and a woman narrowly avoided death simply for posting a photo online. Thankfully, Braden will likely never see freedom again. He was consequently convicted of murder and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and was sentenced to life in prison. Number 9. Benjamin Middendorf. 25-year-old Benjamin Middendorf called 911 one night in 2016 and told a dispatcher that he shot his brother, 28-year-old Nicholas Middendorf. In the background, a woman later identified as the brother's mom could be heard saying, "I'm going to kill my son, and I hope you go to jail." Police got to the family's St. Cloud, Florida home to find Nicholas dead from a gunshot wound to the chest and Benjamin soaked in blood. They immediately took Benjamin into custody on suspicion of murder. Investigators learned that the argument started after Nicholas and their mom got home from a night out drinking for Cinco de Mayo. Benjamin said he didn't drink that day and accused the victim of bullying him. In a statement, St. Cloud Police Department spokesperson Denise Roberts said that the argument that sparked the shooting was over a cheeseburger. Not surprisingly, authorities didn't see this as a justified reason to shoot someone and charged him with first-degree premeditated murder. The case fell off the airwaves after it made headlines after Benjamin's arrest. Florida prison records show that he served a 3-year sentence for a manslaughter charge and has since been released. Number 8. Ezekiel Hicks. When 41-year-old Craig Brewer got the sudden urge to pay it forward at a Waffle House in Gainesville, Florida at 2:30 in the morning back in 2019, he probably didn't expect it to end in violence. The Good Samaritan started randomly handing out $20 bills to fellow customers and covering their meals, and a young woman allegedly got jealous that she wasn't included in his generosity. A man that the disgruntled diner was with, who was later identified as 25-year-old Ezekiel Hicks, confronted Brewer with his friend's complaints. An argument ensued and Hicks went out to the parking lot shortly before coming back with a gun. A customer tried to talk him out of going inside, but he didn't listen. Hicks then shot Brewer in the middle of the crowded restaurant and fled the scene. Police were already on their way to the restaurant since an employee had called them before the shooting and asked for help clearing people out. Officers got there and found the victim dead from multiple gunshot wounds, including at least one to the head. The entire incident was captured on surveillance footage from start to finish. Authorities initially charged Hicks with first-degree murder, but he took a plea deal for a reduced manslaughter charge and one gun-related charge. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Number 7. Caitlin O'Donovan and Sarah Franks. In 2023, at 3 in the morning one day, a Florida man was standing on the balcony of his Clearwater home when two women appeared. 29-year-old Sarah Franks and 29-year-old Caitlin O'Donovan argued with the man and then chucked a bucket full of glitter towards him. Franks then climbed over the balcony and into the house, armed with even more glitter, and led O'Donovan into the home by opening the front door. The women allegedly covered the home with sparkles and then left, with Franks stopping to kick in a window on her way out. Police were notified of the incident and tracked the women down. They noticed that Frank's car was warm to the touch and even saw glitter inside. Authorities charged Franks and O'Donovan with felony burglary, and Franks caught a criminal mischief charge for kicking the victim's window. The suspects bonded out for $75,000, and the charges were eventually dropped. Franks told the Smoking Gun that she and O'Donovan were married and that they had both had a casual relationship with the glitter bomb victim. Their three-way fling was no longer happening when the glitter incident took place, but Franks didn't go into further detail about the situation or what inspired the glitter assault. Number 6. Luis Martin Pages. In 2020, 911 dispatchers in Miami, Florida got a troubling call from a young man who said that he snapped and shot his mother. Officers responded to the Miami Beach home of 29-year-old Luis Martin Pages, who surrendered to their custody. In the house, they found 59-year-old Miriam Gonzalez dead. According to police documents, the shooting came after a series of petty arguments between the mother and son.
Pages reportedly asked his mom if he could borrow her car to look for jobs, but she said no since it was Labor Day and she didn't think any businesses would be open. The suspect also accused Gonzalez of ripping a container of orange juice out of his hand and throwing it into the trash and refusing to let him use the remote control for their AC unit. He also claimed that Gonzalez threatened him with a knife. Unable to control his pent-up rage, Pages allegedly grabbed his gun and shot at his mother. He said he tried to turn the gun on himself but had no more bullets. Authorities later charged him with second-degree murder. The man reportedly had no prior history with law enforcement before the shooting. According to jail records, he's now being held without bond while his case is pending. Number 5. John Mark Barber. In a bizarre dispute that a judge later described as petty, a fight among residents at an apartment complex in Boulder, Colorado, over feeding squirrels led to gunfire. It all started when neighbors noticed 59-year-old John Mark Barber leaving pounds of peanuts outside on a regular basis. Parents expressed concerns over some children with peanut allergies who lived at the property and found Barber's hobby to be messy. In response to the complaints, Barber created flyers explaining that feeding the squirrels is his way of connecting with his dead parents. He got mad when he saw a neighbor, Jeffrey Browning, taking down the flyers. As a result, there was a confrontation, and Barber shot Browning in the butt from behind. He then called 911 and admitted to the shooting. Authorities charged Barber with attempted murder and first-degree assault. In court, he claimed he shot the man in self-defense, but the jury didn't buy it, and he was convicted of both charges. At his sentencing hearing, Deputy District Attorney Lisa Sacamano expressed a deep concern over Barber's lack of remorse and refusal to take responsibility for his actions. She also found it troubling that Barber didn't think he needed any sort of mental health treatment and was concerned he would pose a danger to the public in the future. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison. According to state prison records, Barber's next parole hearing will be in 2024, and he'll be released in 2027 at the latest. Number 4. Eric Aguirre. 29-year-old Eric Aguirre met up with a date at a restaurant in Houston, Texas, during early 2023 and was told that he had to pay a $20 parking fee. The attendant at the lot said that as long as he came back outside with a receipt proving that he ate at the restaurant, he'd eventually get his money back. So Aguirre went to a nearby ATM for cash and paid $40 for himself and his date to park their two vehicles. They were about to sit down for dinner when an employee came up to Aguirre and told him that the person in the parking lot who had charged him to park was actually a scammer. Aguirre told his date he'd be right back after hearing this and went outside the restaurant. When he came back a few minutes later, he told his date that everything was fine and that he had simply scared the scammer away. But Aguirre seemed on edge, and he decided at the last minute that he and his date should eat dinner somewhere else. The woman was shocked to find out the next day that the fake parking lot attendant, Elliot Nix, had been fatally shot from behind while Aguirre went outside. Police had posted surveillance photographs of her and Aguirre online in hopes of receiving help identifying them. Wanting to make it crystal clear that she had no involvement whatsoever in the murder, the woman called the police herself and shared everything that she knew. Witnesses reported seeing Aguirre grabbing his gun from his car and chasing after the victim. They heard a gunshot, then saw Aguirre calmly walking back to his car, where he put his gun back and went back inside the restaurant. He was later charged with murder and could possibly face life in prison if convicted. Number 3. Trevor Gibbon. 45-year-old Allison Morrison was ambushed by her neighbor, 48-year-old Trevor Gibbon, while walking to work in London in 2015. Gibbon approached a woman with 2 knives and stabbed her in what seems to be a well-thought-out attack. Morrison clung to life just long enough to help identify her attacker. The murder came one morning after Morrison was granted an order of protection against Gibbon, marking what she hoped was the end of a petty rivalry that her obsessed neighbor couldn't let go of. The man also pleaded guilty to harassment the day before Morrison's death. The feud started after Morrison moved into the building with her husband and son in 2011. Gibbon and his partner, Maria Perret, began complaining immediately about Morrison's son supposedly making strange noises. Fearing for her family's safety, Morrison installed a security camera in her house. It wasn't long before she felt like she was being watched. Police tried to mediate between the two parties in hopes of helping them come to an understanding, but Gibbon and Perrette were unwilling to even try negotiating. According to complaints filed by Morrison, Gibbon banged pots and pans together during the morning, flashed his car lights towards her home, blocked her car in their shared driveway, and did more. On one occasion, he pulled his car up next to Morrison and her husband, who were also in their vehicle, and simply stared at them before driving away. Gibbon also allegedly followed Morrison's husband to his workplace. After being convicted of harassment and served with an order of protection, he reportedly threw a tantrum inside the courtroom. As the day wore on, his anger became unbearable. Gibbon fled the murder scene in his car. When police tracked him down, he stomped his feet and threw another fit about how he hadn't done anything wrong. In court, he tried to blame his actions on mental illness and claimed he had zero memory of the attack. He probably cried more when the jury refused to buy his lies and convicted him of murder. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Number 2. Nima Momeni. Cash App founder Bob Lee was discovered stabbed to death in San Francisco during April 2023. Through surveillance footage, authorities traced the murder to a 38-year-old IT consultant named Nima Momeni. They apprehended him after a 9-day manhunt and officially charged him with the murder. According to court documents, Lee was in town visiting from Miami. The day before the crime, he drank at a friend's apartment with some people, including Momeni's sister, Kazar Eliasnia. He eventually went back to his hotel room with a friend who overheard Lee talking on the phone with Momeni. The witness said that Momeni asked Lee if his sister had used drugs or done anything inappropriate during the night. Lee reassured him that nothing inappropriate happened. Eliasria is married to a prominent plastic surgeon. The nature of her relationship with Lee and whether her marriage was struggling at the time are unclear, but some speculate that the two had a romantic fling. The friend left shortly after midnight and Lee went to Eliasnia's home. Charging documents state that Lee and Momeni left together 80 minutes later in Momeni's car. The vehicle went in the opposite direction of the victim's hotel. Surveillance footage reportedly showed two individuals, believed to be Momeni and Lee, walking to a dark and secluded area. In the video, one of the people could be seen lunging toward the other with an object and then quickly leaving the scene while the other seemed injured. Lee clung to life long enough to call 911 and report the stabbing. By the time an officer got there, he was unresponsive and bleeding uncontrollably. He was rushed to the hospital where he died on the operating table with a stab wound to the heart. While searching through his phone, detectives found a text from Eliasnia expressing concern for Lee's well-being and acknowledging that her brother came way down hard on you during their talk the night before. She thanked Lee for handling the situation with class. A toxicology report showed that Lee had alcohol, cocaine, and ketamine in his system when he was killed. Momeni's defense attorney, Paula Canny, suggested that drug use may have played a role in whatever sort of altercation happened before Lee's death. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that someone using drugs doesn't automatically give others a license to kill them. District Attorney Brooke Jenkins told the press that it's a common strategy for defense attorneys to shift blame to the victim. The case is still in its early stages and will probably take quite some time to work its way through the court system, so we'll have to be patient as it progresses. Number 1. Thomas Gilbert Jr. One afternoon in 2015, Thomas Gilbert Jr. showed up at his parents' Midtown Manhattan apartment. It was his first time seeing them in months. Thomas wanted to talk with his dad, Thomas Sr., alone and asked his mom, Shelley, to buy him a soda and some lunch. She offered to cook, but he insisted on her picking up food. Simply happy to see her son and hoping he'd work out his differences with his dad, Shelley left. But she was immediately overcome with a strange sense of dread. Things had been rocky between Thomas and his father, and while Shelley initially thought her son had come over to make peace, something seemed off. She was gone for no longer than a few minutes when she came home and found Thomas Sr. on the floor with a gunshot wound in his head. Thomas Jr. had already left the apartment by that point. The shooter left a gun in his father's hand in an attempt to make it look as though he had taken his own life. But Shelley already knew what had actually happened, and she told the 911 dispatcher she spoke with that her son shot her husband, stating that Thomas was Nuts, but I didn't know he was this nuts. Thomas Gilbert Sr. was a successful hedge fund manager who had given his son an incredibly privileged life, which included a prestigious and paid-for education at Princeton University. But Thomas Jr. failed to hold steady employment after graduating college with an economics degree. His father hoped he would go into finance and take over the family business, but he only worked with him for a short period. Yet he stayed on the payroll, and he continued to live off his parents' achievements well into his adulthood. Thomas Jr. relied on his mother and father to pay his $2,400 rent, his vehicle payments, travel expenses, and exclusive gym and country club memberships on top of the $1,000 per week allowance they gave him. He also often hit his parents up for extra cash on top of his allowance, sometimes receiving as much as $10,000 per month from them. To put it plainly, the man was a leech. The Gilberts eventually got tired of supporting their adult son and saw no reason why he couldn't work and pay his own bills. In the months leading up to Thomas Sr.'s murder, he gradually reduced Thomas Jr.'s weekly allowance to $300, stopped paying his rent, and told his son that he needed to get his life together. After the murder, Thomas Jr. spent the next 4 years wasting away at Rikers Island Jail as his attorneys and the prosecutor argued over whether he was competent enough to stand trial. Prosecutors accused him of having an overinflated sense of entitlement and murdering his father in cold blood when Thomas Sr. told him that he had to be an adult. With supporting testimony from multiple experts, the killer's attorney argued that his client suffers from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder and paranoid schizophrenia, and that he didn't recognize that his actions were morally wrong at the time of the shooting. The court ultimately ruled that Thomas was competent and could stand trial. During the proceedings, the court heard about the defendant's history of responding to petty disputes with violence. A former roommate claimed that Gilbert punched him in the face for allegedly mistreating his dog. Not long after that, the roommate's family's home in the Hamptons mysteriously burned to the ground somehow. No one was ever charged for the arson, but the roommate firmly believes that Gilbert had something to do with it. In deciding their verdict, the jury was asked to consider whether they thought the defendant was aware of the wrongfulness of his actions. Nobody disagreed that Thomas was severely mentally ill, but based on the fact that he sent his mom out to buy a sandwich and a Coke, something that he knew his parents wouldn't have lying around in their apartment, the jury decided that his actions were too deliberate for him to be unaware that what he was doing wasn't wrong. Thomas was convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison, despite his mother's pleas for the judge to institutionalize him instead. And while some have argued that he fell through the cracks of a legal system that punishes mental illness, many believe that he's exactly where he should be.
Thanks for watching. Would you rather be accused of wildly overreacting as a default reaction to stressful situations, or for acting completely indifferent at times when people are expected to show emotion? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.